Hi, everyone. Meteorologist Bill Rentschler with meteorologist Carmelo Lattuca in the 1011 Now streaming studio for your latest Weather Academy segment. Carmelo, you were very excited about today's segment. We're talking about hail, what it is, kind of how it grows, how big it can get, what we need to kind of watch out for.
Absolutely. It's one of those weather phenomena. It doesn't have to be severe, technically, by National Weather Service standards. It's not always going to be destructive, but it's something that happens pretty often with almost any thunderstorm that develops, especially in the summertime.
Yeah, we see a lot of hail in Nebraska, and again, it can be anywhere from just, pea size. It's not really going to do anything. Might sting on your face if it hits you in the face a little bit. But, all the way up to softball to grapefruit size hail that's 4 to 4.5 inches in diameter. So, again, can run a huge wide range of sizes, can be very destructive, again, especially to agriculture, fields, crops, and things like that. Also just buildings and things like that. So it is something we need to watch out for and be careful with.
Most definitely. And you already talked about the sizes, but basically it forms through convective processes in thunderstorms. We'll get more into that in just a moment. But at its simplest, it's an opaque or white ball of ice, sometimes with visible layers, and we're going to talk about that right now.
And so basically there's a couple different ways that hail can form and grow, but again, I think the most common of which is basically starts off with something that ice can freeze onto, whether that's just an itty-bitty little speck of dust, a piece of salt, ash, something.
Some sort of particulate.
Some sort of particulate that's in the atmosphere, incredibly small, but a surface that we can start with. And then as you go up in the atmosphere in these thunderstorms, again, temperatures do get well below freezing, and so you have this hailstone that starts. And then this updraft, as this hailstone is bouncing up and down in this updraft, because the updraft is not one constant speed.
Right.
It basically goes through this process of melting and refreezing. It's colliding with other raindrops. It's colliding with other hailstones. It accumulates water, and so then when it does refreeze, it just gathers these layers. So it's almost like tree rings on a tree. You can see in some of the pictures on here, if you took a cross section of a hailstone, it has these layers, and so it just continues to grow and grow and grow. Until eventually gravity always wins.
Reigns supreme.
It does.
In terms of the atmospheric phenomena of hail.
And so eventually that hailstone becomes so big that the updraft can't hold it anymore, and so that's when it falls to the ground. So again, obviously, the more intense thunderstorms with the more intense updrafts have generally the biggest hail.
Absolutely, and our updraft speeds before gravity can overtake it can be anywhere from 24 miles an hour to almost 100 miles an hour, and the stronger speeds pushing that hail up, obviously the larger the hail is going to be. So 60 miles per hour, we're getting up to ping pong ball sized hail. 77 miles an hour, tennis ball. When you get close to 100, it's grapefruit size.
77 miles an hour, that's probably the speed most people go on the interstate.
Absolutely. So imagine that just pushing
straight
all
up,
of these
upwards.
Gigantic pieces of ice back into the cloud.
So some really intense wind speeds, and it's always the part that I still have kind of trouble wrapping my head around.
Yes.
But again, as far as the sizes, again, we see pea, dime, nickel-sized hail
all the time.
But again, not severe. Quarter-sized hail, 1 inch in diameter. That's kind of our cutoff. That's when you can start to see at least some damage start to being done. So quarter-sized hail is what we'd call severe hail. 2-inch diameter hail, that's when you'd call that significant sized hail. But again, we see hail all the way up to softball to grapefruit size at least a couple times every season.
Absolutely. I think quarter to golf ball, pretty common when it comes to severe weather season. You get that slight enhanced risk of severe weather. You're usually going to see that if there's a hail risk within that kind of day. When you start getting to tennis ball, baseball, and especially softball, it gets to become a little more uncommon and eventually a little bit more rare.
Yeah, and so what we see, you mentioned what we see a lot of the time. What we don't see a lot of the time is a hailstone that fell out of this thunderstorm. This is the radar loop we're seeing right now, the thunderstorm that produced the largest ever observed hailstone in the United States, and it fell in Vivian, South Dakota in July of 2010. Again, not too far away from us, but you can see with the reflectivity, there's some pinks, there's some whites, so indicative of very intense updraft, very intense thunderstorm, and it produced this hailstone, which when it was documented was 8 inches in diameter.
The size of a 2-pound bowling ball.
Just short of 19 inches in circumference. So it left a crater in the ground. Incredibly intense. Again, this is something we very rarely see, hailstones above 4 to 4.5 inches. We very rarely see hailstones that big.
Absolutely, and the public being there to confirm this made all the difference, because we never would have known this just seeing this on the radar, because we see the whites and pinks on the radar almost all the time come the summer months, but this was a pretty big hailstone. The story behind it, though, pretty interesting. This guy, he found it in his backyard. He called the National Weather Service. They told him, we can get there the next day, put it in your freezer. He lost power. So that means this hailstone likely melted a little bit. I mean, just to think 8 inches across from one side to the other, still pretty big, but it likely was a little bit bigger than that.
And so it actually beat the old record, which used to be even closer to us, which was in Aurora, Nebraska back in 2003. That hailstone, I believe, still holds the record for circumference.
Yes.
But not for diameter. So, but some pretty incredibly large hail there. Thankfully, that is something that we do not see very often. Again,
And hopefully we never see it.
locally, Lincoln saw a pretty nasty hailstorm back in 2016, southeast side of town, softball-sized hail, and it did a tremendous amount of damage. So again, thankfully, it's not something we see all that often, but when we do see it, it can be pretty destructive.
Absolutely.
All right, so it's another edition of the Weather Academy. Appreciate everyone for tuning in, watching. We have previous segments on different topics. Again, you can find all those on our 1011 platforms, whether that's 1011now.com or streaming apps or on the 1011 YouTube channel. So appreciate everyone for tuning in, watching as always. We'll see you next time.